Welcome. We have all experienced times when the mind begins to move ahead of life. It drifts into the future, imagining possibilities, outcomes, and uncertainties that have not yet arrived. In these moments, the body may still be sitting quietly, yet internally, there can be a sense of tension, as though something important needs to be resolved before anything has actually happened. In such moments, the mind can create entire scenarios out of possibilities alone, and then respond to them as though they were already real. Anxiety often appears in this space between what is happening and what could potentially happen. It is not always tied to a specific event either. Sometimes it is simply a quiet unease, a subtle sense that something is uncertain or incomplete, where the mind searches for clarity, for reassurance, for some way of resolving what has not yet unfolded. Yet the future, by its nature, remains unknown. And in that uncertainty, the mind can begin to circle. In Buddhist thought, this tendency of the mind is not seen as unusual. It is simply part of how the human mind functions. Rather than trying to eliminate anxiety entirely, Buddhist teachings often invite a different kind of relationship with it. Not one of resistance, but one of understanding. And within that understanding, the burden can start to feel lighter. One reflection that can be helpful is the recognition that the future exists largely as a construction of the mind. Plans can be made, which can lead to expectations being formed, but the reality of what will happen has not yet taken shape. The mind, however, is capable of projecting forward, filling in details, imagining outcomes, and then reacting to those imagined scenarios. Have you ever noticed how convincing these imagined futures can feel, even when there is no immediate evidence that they will ever occur? In this way, anxiety often arises from the mind's attempt to predict and prepare for what has not yet happened. Another idea within Buddhism is the principle of impermanence. Everything that arises, including thoughts and emotions, is in a constant state of change. Anxiety, when it appears, can feel overwhelming in the moment, as though it might remain indefinitely. Yet if observed closely, it rarely stays exactly the same. It shifts in intensity, it comes and goes, it rises and falls. Sometimes it fades without any clear resolution at all. What happens when anxiety is seen not as a fixed state, but as something that moves, changes, and eventually passes? There can be a small sense of space in recognizing that even this feeling is not permanent. There is also a subtle distinction that Buddhism often makes between thoughts and reality. The mind produces a continuous stream of thoughts, some helpful, some not, many of them repetitive. When anxiety is present, these thoughts often carry a certain tone, focusing on risk, uncertainty, or potential difficulty. Over time, it can begin to feel as though these thoughts are describing something real, something that must be resolved immediately. Yet if they are observed carefully and without judgment, they are simply mental events, appearing and disappearing on their own. Have you ever noticed how a thought can arise, feel convincing for a moment, and then fade without anything actually changing? In that observation, it becomes possible to see that a thought, no matter how persuasive, is not necessarily a reflection of reality. At times, the body can offer a different kind of anchor. While the mind moves forward into imagined futures, the body remains in the present moment. The sensation of breathing, for example, is always happening here, now, regardless of what the mind is doing. In Buddhist practice, attention is often gently returned to something simple and immediate, such as the breath, not as a technique to remove anxiety, but as a way of reconnecting with what is actually present. Have you ever noticed how even a brief moment of awareness of the breath can create a small pause in the movement of the mind? Another reflection involves the idea of control. The mind often tries to reduce anxiety by gaining certainty, by planning, analyzing, and anticipating every possible outcome. This effort can feel necessary, as though clarity will bring relief. Yet much of life unfolds beyond direct control. Outcomes depend on many conditions, many of which are not fully visible or predictable. When the mind holds tightly to the idea that everything must be controlled, tension can naturally arise. What happens when that grip loosens, even slightly? Not as a form of resignation, but as a quiet recognition that not everything needs to be resolved in advance. Seen together, these reflections begin to shift the way anxiety is understood. Rather than something that must be removed or fixed, it can be seen as a natural response of the mind attempting to navigate uncertainty. In that sense, anxiety is not necessarily a problem in itself, but a signal of the mind's effort to find stability in a world that is constantly changing. Of course, understanding this does not mean that anxious feelings immediately disappear. The experience may still arise, sometimes strongly, sometimes unexpectedly. Yet within that experience there can be a subtle difference. Instead of becoming fully entangled in the movement of thought, there may be moments where the mind steps back slightly, noticing what is happening rather than being completely carried by it. And perhaps this is where something within us begins to shift. Not in a dramatic way, but quietly and gradually. The mind no longer needs to chase every thought to its conclusion. It no longer needs to resolve every uncertainty before it has arrived. There can be moments where the breath is simply felt, where thoughts are noticed without being followed, where the future is allowed to remain unknown for a little while longer. In Buddhist practice, this kind of awareness is not about achieving a perfect state of calm. It is about seeing clearly, seeing the movement of the mind, the nature of thoughts, the changing quality of emotions. And within that clarity, there can be a gradual softening of the struggle. So next time, when anxiety appears, it may not always be something that needs to be pushed away. It may simply be something that can be observed with a little curiosity. A pattern of the mind moving forward, imagining, preparing, and reacting. And within that observation, there can be a definite sense that not everything needs to be held so tightly. We can allow the future to remain uncertain. Thoughts can come and go without needing to be resolved. And even in these struggles, there can still be a moment of stillness, exactly as things are. If this video felt helpful to you, please return whenever you need. And if you'd like to support this space, liking or subscribing helps these videos reach others who might currently be struggling with anxiety too. Thank you for being here, and take care of yourself.